I was standing in the middle of my own wooden bridge when Lenora Vance, the president of the Homeowners Association, handed me a repair invoice for almost $200,000. Behind her sat 28 finished houses, and every single one of them had exactly one way out to the county road, a bridge sitting entirely on land I paid for. She smiled at me the way people smile at a slow child and said I should feel grateful, because her association had raised property values for the whole valley. What she did not know was that I had just found the original development plan. In that plan, my bridge was never their entrance. If you enjoy watching a homeowners association dig its own hole, subscribe right now, because the real reversal is still coming. My name is Isaiah Rowan. I am 48 years old, and I bought the land on the south side of Cedar Creek back when nobody else wanted it. 11 acres, a farmhouse that needed a new roof, a metal shop I rebuilt myself over 3 summers, and a single-lane bridge of steel beams and heavy timber decking that connects my driveway to Ridgeline County Road. The bridge came with the property, built in the 1960s by a rancher who wanted to get a tractor across the water without driving 4 miles around. I had the deck replaced once, about 12 years ago, and I kept the steel painted because rust is patient and I am not. It was rated for personal vehicles, pickup trucks, and light equipment, and that is exactly what crossed it. My truck, my welding trailer, the propane man twice a winter, and the occasional visitor who got lost looking for the fishing access. My land is not part of any homeowners association, and that is not an opinion, it is a matter of recorded fact. Cedar Hollow Estates did not exist when I signed my closing papers, and no covenant, condition, or restriction has ever attached to my parcel. I have the deed, I have the survey, and I have a title policy in a fireproof box in my hallway closet because my father taught me that paper outlives arguments. For most of the years I lived there, none of this mattered to anybody because the other side of my property line was 300 acres of pasture where somebody ran cattle until the price of hay stopped making sense. I liked it that way. I liked the fog sitting on the creek in October and the way the steel on the bridge would tick and settle as the sun came up. Then a development company out of the city bought the pasture and filed for permits to build 28 upper-end houses. I did not fight it, and I want to be clear about why, because people always assume I must have hated the idea from the start. I drove to the county building the week the notice went up, sat down with a planner, and read the site plan cover to cover. It showed a northern access route off Falls Grade Road, and it showed a proposed 2-lane bridge to be built about half a mile downstream from mine, on their side of the creek, at their expense. Their traffic had a plan, and their plan did not touch my parcel anywhere. I remember driving home thinking that somebody had actually done the engineering right for once. For nearly 2 years, everything I saw matched what I had read. Concrete trucks, lumber haulers, excavators on lowboys, all of them coming and going along the northern route on the far side of the property, kicking up a brown ribbon of dust I could see from my back porch. I never once had construction traffic on my bridge, and that absence told me the site plan was being followed. I watched the framing go up, watched the roofs go on, watched the streetlights get installed along curving streets, with names like Wren Hollow Lane and Silver Birch Court. 28 houses, big ones, the kind with 3-car garages, and stone veneer around the front door. My neighbor situation was changing, but the boundaries were not, and boundaries were what I cared about. I figured the worst thing I would suffer was headlights at night and somebody's dog in my hayfield. I was wrong, and I found out on an ordinary Tuesday morning in early spring. I was standing at the kitchen sink filling the coffee pot when I heard tires on timber, which is a sound I know the way a parent knows a child's cough. I looked out the window over the sink and watched a silver sport utility vehicle come off my bridge, turn left onto the county road, and drive away like it had done it 100 times. Before I could set the pot down, a second one crossed, then a third, all of them coming from the new subdivision side, all of them rolling straight across my property. 3 vehicles in 90 seconds on a bridge that had averaged 4 crossings a day for 20 years. I put my boots on without finishing the coffee. The first thing I found at the north end of my bridge was a sign that had not been there when I went to bed. It was a real sign, too, not something taped to a stake, but a routed cedar board with gold lettering on a green field, mounted on 2 pressure-treated posts sunk in concrete. It said Cedar Hollow Estates, resident access, and underneath in smaller letters it said private community, guests please register. The posts were driven into my ground, about 11 feet inside my property line, in soil I had dissed and reseeded myself 2 autumns earlier. Somebody had come onto my land with a post-hole digger and a bag of creek mix and decided that my dirt was theirs to decorate. I stood there for a full minute doing the math on how many people had driven past that sign already and assumed it meant something. I walked the length of the bridge and looked at the deck boards, which is a habit at this point. There were fresh scuffs in the timber and 2 new gouges near the center span where something heavy had shifted. I took photographs with my phone, including the sign, the posts, the concrete, and a wide shot showing the county road behind it, because I have learned that a photograph without context is just a picture. Then I went back to the house, found the developer's name on an old permit notice I had saved, and started making calls. The developer's office routed me to a management company, and the management company gave me a number for the Cedar Hollow Estates Homeowners Association. That is how I first spoke to Lenora Vance. She answered on the second ring with a bright, practiced voice, and the brightness lasted exactly as long as it took me to explain who I was. I told her, plainly and without heat, that residents were driving across a private bridge on my parcel, and that somebody had installed association signage on my land without permission. I did not accuse anybody of anything criminal. I said I wanted the sign removed and I wanted to understand what everyone believed was happening. There was a pause, and then her tone changed into something flatter and more managerial, the voice of a person who has decided the conversation is a formality. She said that the board had reviewed the mapping, that the crossing served the community now, and that these things had already been worked out at a level above both of us. I asked her what level that was, and she said the site development level, which is not a real thing anyone can point to. Then she said the sentence I have repeated to a lot of people since. She said my bridge now serves 30 households, and that I needed to start thinking like a member of a community instead of like one man with a driveway. I told her I was not a member of her association, that my property predated her subdivision by decades, and that the bridge was private property with a private maintenance history. She responded by asking whether I had ever actually worked in land development, in a tone that made the question a verdict. When I said I had not, she said she thought so, and that documents like these can be confusing to people without professional exposure. That was the moment I understood what kind of problem this was going to be. It was not a mistake made by a surveyor with a bad afternoon. It was a person who had already decided how a conversation was going to end before it began. I kept my voice level and asked her one simple thing: send me the recorded easement that grants Cedar Hollow Estates the right to cross my parcel. Any legitimate access right would exist as a document with a book and page number at the county recorder, and if she had it, this would be over in one email. She told me the board had reviewed the maps and was confident of its position. I asked again for the document. She said, and I wrote it down within 2 minutes of hanging up, that she did not need my permission to use infrastructure that serves the neighborhood. 2 days later I got a letter, and it was not what I expected. I had braced for an easement claim, or a lawyer's letter arguing that long use had created some kind of right, or even an offer to buy a crossing agreement. Instead, I opened a document on association letterhead titled Notice of Required Infrastructure Remediation, addressed to me as the owner of record of the Rowan crossing. It stated that the guardrails, the deck surface, and the structural members of the bridge required upgrading to accommodate the traffic volume generated by 28 residences. It included a bid summary from a contractor I had never heard of, itemized across 4 pages, with a total at the bottom in bold type, $186,400, and the letter directed me to remit payment or arrange financing within 60 days. My reply was 4 sentences long, sent by certified mail with a return receipt because I wanted a signature in the record. I wrote that I am not a member of Cedar Hollow Estates, that the association has no authority to levy assessments, fines, or maintenance obligations against my parcel, and that the crossing is private property. I asked once more for a copy of any recorded easement granting the association a right of access. I stated that until such a document was produced, all use of the crossing by association residents and their contractors was permissive at best and would be evaluated accordingly. I did not threaten anything, because threats are what people reach for when they do not have paper. I signed it with my name and nothing else. Lenora escalated within a week, and she escalated in a direction that told me more than she meant to tell me. The next envelope contained a notice of infrastructure violation, complete with a case number and a schedule of daily penalties, beginning at $250 per day for continued non-compliance. It cited association governing documents by article and section, none of which had any bearing on a parcel that was not in the association. It warned that unpaid penalties could result in a lien against my property. That last part was the tell. She was not trying to buy access, and she was not trying to negotiate access. She was trying to establish, in writing and by repetition, that I was the party financially responsible for the sole entrance to her entire subdivision. Once I understood that, everything else clicked into a shape. A private bridge that the association could use for free was worth something. A private bridge whose owner could be pressured into paying for its upgrades was worth vastly more, because it moved a permanent capital cost off the association's books and onto mine forever. Every year of deck replacement, every guardrail, every inspection, every eventual full rebuild would be my problem while 28 households drove across it. She was not being sloppy. She was being efficient, in the way that a person is efficient when they have found somebody they believe cannot push back. I put the violation notice in the box with the rest. Meanwhile, the traffic multiplied, and it stopped being sport utility vehicles. Moving trucks came through, the big ones with the trailer, dropping into the approach at an angle that made the whole span shudder. Landscaping crews arrived towing dual-axle trailers loaded with river rock and sod pallets. Delivery vans came 4 and 5 times a day, and one afternoon a boom truck crossed to set a light pole on Wren Hollow Lane. I started keeping a spiral notebook on the kitchen windowsill and writing down the date, the time, the vehicle type, and the plate when I could read it. Within 2 weeks, the notebook had over 300 entries, and I ordered 2 weatherproof cameras and mounted them on the corner of my shop, with a clear line of sight down the approach. Lenora came to my house in person on a Thursday afternoon in April. She parked her sedan in my gravel turnaround without asking, walked up to my shop where I was cutting stock for a handrail job, and waited with visible impatience for me to shut the saw down. She was polished and pleasant for about 11 seconds. Then she told me that I was holding an entire neighborhood hostage, that families with children lived back there, and that all of this was happening because one man needed to prove he was important. She said the board was prepared to take legal action, and that lawyers cost money I probably did not have. I pulled my hearing protection down around my neck and let her finish, because people reveal themselves in the last third of a speech. Then I asked her the question I had been holding for a month. I asked why, if my bridge was so essential to her community had built 28 houses before securing any right to use it. Not angry, not loud, just the plain shape of the thing. Lenora opened her mouth, and nothing came out. She stood in my gravel for what felt like a long time, and I watched something move behind her eyes that was not indignation and was not confusion. It was calculation, the look of a person deciding how much of the truth the other person already has. She recovered, said the board would be in touch through counsel, and left, and I stood there, with a piece of hot steel in my hand, knowing for certain that she was hiding something. The county records office is on the second floor of a building with bad carpet and excellent air conditioning, and I got there 20 minutes after it opened on a Monday. The clerk at the land records counter was a woman named Maren Sloan, mid-30s, reading glasses pushed up in her hair, the kind of person who lights up when somebody asks a question that is actually about the records. I told her I needed my own parcel survey, any recorded easements touching my parcel, and the full development file for Cedar Hollow Estates. She asked if I wanted the whole file, and I said I wanted every page. She said that would take some time. I told her I had brought a thermos. My survey came up first, and it was as clean as I remembered. The parcel boundary ran along the north edge of the creek's far bank, which meant the bridge, both abutments, both wing walls, and roughly 90 feet of gravel approach on the far side were all inside my lines. There was no dedicated right-of-way, no dedicated roadway, no access easement, nothing granting any third party the right to travel across my ground. There was one recorded easement, a 20-foot strip running east to west near the north end, and Maren pulled the instrument for me. It was a utility easement, granted in 1981, for the installation and maintenance of electrical distribution lines and a buried water main. It said nothing about vehicular access, and utility easements never do, because carrying a power line and carrying traffic are not remotely the same right. I asked Maren whether a person could confuse those two things, and she gave me a careful look and said a person could, but a board with counsel generally would not. She showed me how the utility easement appears on a certain older composite map as a hatched strip running from the subdivision's southwest corner toward the county road, passing within about 60 feet of my bridge approach. If you were looking at a reduced-scale copy and you wanted to see a right of access, you could persuade yourself it was there. If you were looking at the actual recorded instrument, you could not. That distinction was going to become the center of everything. I asked for certified copies of both. Then Maren brought out the Cedar Hollow development file, and it was 4 inches thick. We spread it on a table by the window, and I started at the beginning, because the beginning is where people put the truth before they need to hide it. The approved preliminary plat was dated a little over 3 years earlier, and it included a sheet labeled Access and Circulation. Right there in the legend, in the same typeface as everything else, was the phrase that changed my life for the next several months. It read Permanent Primary Access Bridge, Developer Responsibility, and an arrow pointed to a structure drawn across Cedar Creek about half a mile downstream of my crossing, entirely on the development's own frontage. A second note gave the design standard: 2 lanes, pedestrian walkway, engineered for emergency apparatus. I sat back in that chair and felt the whole thing turn over. There had never been any question about how those houses were supposed to reach the county road, and it had never involved me. The northern route off Falls Grade, the dusty ribbon I had watched for 2 years, appeared on a separate sheet with its own label: Temporary Construction Access. The permit condition attached to it was written in the flat, unglamorous language that permit conditions always use, and it was absolutely clear. The temporary route was authorized for the construction phase and was to remain in service and maintained until the permanent primary access bridge was completed and accepted. The temporary route could not be closed before the permanent bridge existed. That was the deal the developer signed to get his permits. But the permanent bridge had never been built. I went through every subsequent sheet, every amended plat, every inspection sign-off, and there was no completion, no acceptance, no as-built drawing, nothing. There was a cost estimate, though, tucked into a financial exhibit from the original application, and the figure on it was $1,700,000 for design, permitting, abutments, span, approaches, and creek bank stabilization. $1.7 million of infrastructure that 28 houses had been sold on the assumption of, and it existed only on paper. Marin looked over my shoulder at that page and said quietly that she had never noticed this file before. I asked her to certify copies of every sheet I had flagged. The rest of the afternoon I worked forward through the Homeowners Association materials the county had on hand, the annual disclosures, and the transition documents from developer control to resident control. In the earliest resident newsletters, the new bridge was mentioned repeatedly as an upcoming community improvement with an anticipated timeline. Then, about 14 months back, the mentions thinned. Then they stopped. The date the mentions stopped lined up, almost to the week, with the date Lenora Vance was elected president of the Cedar Hollow Estates Board. That could have been coincidence, and I made myself write the word coincidence in my notes so I would not get ahead of the evidence. Then I turned one more page. It was a recent submission, a maintenance and circulation exhibit filed with an amended landscaping plan, dated 5 months earlier. Down in the notes column, in 9-point type where nobody would look twice, somebody had written a single line. It said, "Existing Rowan crossing to serve as permanent residential access." My name on a county document describing my private property as the permanent entrance to a subdivision I had never agreed to serve, submitted without my knowledge or signature. I read it 4 times in the fluorescent light of that records room, and I felt the back of my neck go cold. They had not been confused about the easement at all. They had been substituting my bridge for a $1.7 million structure and hoping nobody would ever check. Once I knew what to look for, I started looking backward instead of forward, and the sales materials were where the whole scheme stopped being an internal accounting decision and became something a person had said out loud to strangers. I found the original Cedar Hollow Estates marketing packet in 3 places. A copy Marin pulled from a development application exhibit, a copy a real estate office in town still had in a back file drawer, and a printed brochure a resident later gave me from her closing folder. All 3 said the same thing on the second page, under a heading about the character of the community. The phrase was "Exclusive Historic Bridge Entrance." Beneath it was a photograph, taken in autumn from the county road looking south, of my steel and timber crossing with the cottonwoods behind it. It was unmistakably my bridge, and it was being sold as an amenity. That brochure did more damage to Lenora's position than any argument I could have made. It established that the bridge had been presented to buyers as part of the community's identity before a single house closed, which meant the intention to use it was not an accident discovered late in construction. It also established that people had bought homes based on a representation about access that the seller had no right to make. I called the real estate office and asked when that packet had first been distributed, and the broker checked and told me the date, which was 8 months before the first certificate of occupancy. No agreement with me existed on that date. No agreement with me existed on any date. Nobody had ever put a single sentence in front of me to sign. I hired an engineer next, because I wanted the physical condition of the structure documented by somebody with a license and a stamp. Grant Hensley was a county infrastructure engineer who did private consulting work on the side, a heavy-set man in his 50s who talked slowly and wrote quickly. He spent most of a day on and under my bridge with a level, a crack gauge, a rebound hammer, and a small notebook of his own. He measured deflection at midspan under a loaded truck, examined both abutments, checked the bearing points, and photographed the underside of every stringer. Then he sat on my tailgate and told me what he had found. The bridge was fundamentally sound for what it was designed to do, and it had been badly abused by something it was never designed to do. His stamped report described plastic deformation in 2 steel stringers, a settlement crack and slight rotation at the east abutment, and 6 deck timbers crushed at the bearing surface, all consistent with repeated overload rather than ordinary wear. He asked whether I could establish when that traffic had occurred, and I told him I had cameras and 2 years of stored footage. We pulled the old drive up on my shop computer, and we spent the better part of 2 evenings scrubbing through it. What we found rearranged the entire dispute. In the final 4 or 5 months of construction, long before any resident moved in, project vehicles had been using my bridge regularly. Concrete mixers with company markings, a tandem axle dump truck hauling base rock, a flatbed carrying scaffold and forms, a tanker, a low boy with a compact excavator. Grant froze one frame on a mixer and estimated its loaded weight at more than 3 times the crossing's posted capacity. The developer's own contractors had been using my private bridge as a shortcut and beating it half to death while the temporary northern route sat right there. So the entire premise of Lenora's demand inverted. The association had billed me $186,400 to repair damage that its own project had caused, using my property without permission, in violation of its own permit conditions. It was not merely aggressive, it was the exact opposite of the truth, presented with a case number and a penalty schedule. Grant said something I have thought about many times since. He said that, in his experience, when a party moves this fast to assign you a liability, it is usually because they already know where the liability actually sits. He put his findings in a stamped report with photographs, load calculations, and a repair scope. Then he told me the part I did not want to hear. His professional recommendation was that residential volume should stop crossing that structure until a formal load rating was completed. Not as a negotiating position, but because the settlement at the east abutment was active, and he could not certify what the span would do under a fully loaded emergency vehicle. I understood the engineering, and I also understood exactly what closing that bridge would mean for 28 households on a Tuesday morning with no notice. Some of those people had children in school. Somebody back there might have a heart condition. Whatever Lenora Vance had done, the families who bought those houses had done nothing but believe a brochure. I was not going to make my point by trapping them. So I did it the slow way instead, which cost me another 3 weeks and a great deal of patience. I wrote to the county planning department, to the public works director, and to the fire district, attaching Grant's report and asking for a coordinated response. I told them plainly that I intended to restrict non-permitted use of a private structure, that I would not do so until an alternative access was in place, and that I was formally requesting the reactivation of the temporary construction route off Falls Grade as an interim measure. I copied the developer. I copied the association. I gave everybody a date, and I gave everybody the engineering. Nobody could later say they had been surprised. Lenora found out that I was working with the county within about 4 days, and her reaction told me she had understood the danger immediately. A calm person in her position would have gone quiet and called a lawyer. Instead, she called an emergency meeting of the Cedar Hollow Estates membership for the following Wednesday evening in the clubhouse, and she sent me a formal invitation to attend, hand-delivered to my mailbox. It was framed as an opportunity to resolve the matter in front of the community. I understood what it actually was. She wanted 28 households in a room, angry, looking at one man, and she wanted me to fold in front of them. I went, and I brought a canvas bag. The clubhouse was a nice building with a stone fireplace nobody had ever used, and about 50 folding chairs and close to 40 people were there when I walked in at 10 minutes to 7. I found a seat in the second-to-last row and set the bag on the floor beside me. Lenora opened the meeting standing at a small podium with a projector remote in her hand, and she got to me in under 3 minutes. She described a difficult neighbor who had recently begun attempting to extract money from the community over a crossing that everyone had been using in good faith since move-in. She said the board had been patient and had tried repeatedly to resolve things amicably. Then she made her central claim, and she made it with total confidence. She said that because every resident had relied on the crossing since the day they arrived, and because it functioned as the community's entrance, the owner of that crossing had a maintenance obligation to the community. Heads nodded. A man near the front said something about liability if somebody got hurt. Lenora agreed and said that was exactly her concern, that the owner's refusal to maintain the structure was putting families at risk. It was well done, honestly. If I had walked into that room with nothing but my opinion, I would have lost. I did not argue with her. When she asked whether I had anything to say, I stood up in the back of that room and asked one question in a normal speaking voice. I asked her to show everyone the easement. She said the board had reviewed the mapping extensively, and I said that was not what I asked, and I asked again for the recorded easement, book, and page. She put a map on the projector. It was the reduced-scale composite, with the hatched 20-foot strip running toward the county road, and she pointed at it and said this documents the access corridor. I walked to the front, and I laid 2 certified documents on the table beside the podium where people could see them. The first was the recorded instrument from 1981, its title line reading easement for electric distribution and water main, with the operative language granting the right to install, maintain, repair, and replace utility facilities, and nothing else. The second was my recorded survey, showing the bridge, both abutments, and the approach entirely within my parcel, with no roadway easement of any kind. Then I asked Lenora, in front of her members, to point to the words in her exhibit that granted anyone the right to drive a vehicle across my land. She looked at the paper for a long moment and said the board had relied on professional guidance. A woman in the 3rd row said, out loud, that a waterline easement is not a road. The temperature in that room changed in about 90 seconds. People who had walked in believing they were dealing with a difficult neighbor were now looking at their board president holding the wrong document. Then Wade Hollis, the association treasurer, stood up. Wade was a retired regional operations manager for a freight company, a compact man with a gray mustache and the unhurried manner of somebody who has audited a lot of numbers. He said he had a budget question, and he asked it carefully. He asked why, in the 3 years of financial materials he had reviewed since joining the board, there had never been a line item, a reserve allocation, or a disclosure regarding the $1.7 million permanent access bridge described in the approved development plan. Lenora said the project had identified a more efficient solution. Wade asked what the solution was. She said the community's existing access had proven adequate and that pursuing redundant infrastructure would have been fiscally irresponsible to the membership. I let a beat pass, and then I asked the question that was sitting in everybody's chest. I asked whether the more efficient solution was taking my bridge for free. Nobody laughed. 40 people sat in absolute silence in a room with a stone fireplace, and Lenora Vance looked at the back wall and said the board would take the matter under advisement and adjourned the meeting. Wade Hollis found me in the parking lot 20 minutes later, standing by my truck in the dark. He said he had spent his working life around freight liability, and he knew the shape of a problem when he saw one. Then he handed me a manila envelope and told me he had pulled it from the association's own management account, which he had every right as treasurer to access, and that he would testify to its authenticity if it ever came to that. Inside were printed copies of internal correspondence between Lenora and a project representative from the development company named Everett Callaway. Most of it was routine, 2 messages were not. The first was from Lenora, 15 months earlier, and it discussed the cost exposure of the permanent bridge and asked whether the temporary route could simply be decommissioned once the final occupancy permits were issued. The second was the one that mattered. In a message about anticipated obstacles, she had written a single sentence that I still have printed and filed. If Rowan objects, the association can apply pressure through maintenance liability. That was not confusion about an easement. That was a plan, written down months before the first violation notice arrived in my mailbox. Wade said he had read it 3 times before he decided to make a copy. I told him I understood exactly what it had cost him to hand it over. The county scheduled the joint meeting for a Thursday morning in a conference room on the 3rd floor, and it was not a hearing in the formal sense, though it functioned like one. Present were 2 people from planning, the Public Works Director, Grant Hensley in his official county capacity, a representative from the Fire District, Everett Calloway for the development company, Lenora Vance and the association's attorney, Wade Hollis as treasurer, and me. Lenora arrived looking every bit the professional, with a leather folio and an attorney in a good suit, and she seemed genuinely confident. I think she believed that a room full of officials would default to the side with counsel. I had a banker's box and a 3-ring binder with tabs. Her attorney opened by arguing that Cedar Hollow Estates had relied on the crossing continuously since occupancy, that the community had no alternative means of ingress and egress, and that the county had an interest in preserving public safety by maintaining the status quo. He suggested that the crossing had effectively become a component of the area's road network, regardless of its ownership history. It was a decent argument, if you started counting time from the day the first family moved in. The whole case depended on nobody looking at what had been promised before that day. I opened my binder. I laid my documents on the table one at a time, and I described each in a single sentence. The deed showing my ownership, the recorded survey showing the crossing, abutments, and approach entirely within my parcel, the 1981 utility easement, with its operative language highlighted, granting no vehicular right whatsoever, the approved preliminary plat with the sheet reading Permanent Primary Access Bridge, developer responsibility, the permit condition requiring the temporary northern construction route to remain in service until the permanent bridge was completed and accepted. The sales brochure advertising an exclusive historic bridge entrance with a photograph of my property. The engineering report with load calculations and photographs of the crushed bearing surfaces and the rotated abutment. Then I put down the last 2 items, and the room went still. The first was a set of time-stamped video stills showing project-marked concrete mixers and a loaded dump truck crossing my bridge during the construction phase, with dates on the frames. The second was Lenora's own message about applying pressure through maintenance liability. Her attorney asked where I had obtained that document, and Wade Hollis said, without being asked, that he had provided it in his capacity as treasurer. The attorney leaned over and said something to Lenora, and she did not respond. The planning director picked up the permit condition sheet and read it twice. Grant Hensley made the observation that ended the argument, and he made it in about 30 seconds. He said the framing of the dispute was backwards. Mr. Rowan was not depriving the development of access, he said, because the development had never completed the access it was permitted and required to build. The community's dependence on a private structure was not a status quo worth preserving. It was the direct consequence of an unfulfilled permit condition. He said that from a county perspective, the appropriate remedy was not to burden a private landowner, but to enforce the original approval. The Public Works Director asked when the temporary northern route had been decommissioned, and Everett Calloway said it had been closed at the end of construction. The Planning Director asked who had authorized that closure, and nobody answered. The county acted quickly after that, faster than I expected. Public Works directed that the temporary construction route off Falls Grade be reopened and restored to serviceable condition within 30 days as an interim access, with the fire district signing off on turning radii and surface. That single decision removed the entire foundation of Lenora's leverage, because from the moment there was another way out, my bridge stopped being the thing the community could not live without. Then the county representative turned to Everett Calloway and asked a question I had not anticipated. She asked about the status of the project's performance bond. I watched Lenora's face when that word was said, and the color went out of it. The bond had never been released. It could not have been released, because the final infrastructure item on the approval, the permanent primary access bridge, had never been completed or accepted, and the county holds that security precisely so that a developer cannot walk away from the last and most expensive piece of a project. Everett Calloway said something about scope changes and value engineering, and the planning director said that scope changes to an approved access plan require an amendment, and asked to see the amendment. There was no amendment. There had never been an amendment. There had only been a line of 9-point type on a landscaping exhibit stating that my crossing would serve as permanent residential access, which nobody with authority had ever approved and which I had never signed. So the reversal was complete, and it was complete in 3 directions at once. I did not owe $186,400 and had never owed a cent of it. The county had the financial instrument in hand to compel the developer to build the 2-lane bridge that had been promised in the original approval, and because the engineering established that the damage to my crossing was caused by overweight project traffic during construction, the liability for those repairs pointed straight back at the developer and its contractors. Lenora Vance had walked into that room to make me responsible for a subdivision's entrance. She walked out having drawn the county's attention to $1.7 million of unbuilt infrastructure and an unreleased bond. Word moved through Cedar Hollow Estates faster than any letter could have carried it. Within a week, people I had never spoken to were slowing down when they passed my gate, and a few actually stopped to talk. What I heard again and again was some version of the same thing. They had been told at closing that access was resolved. Several had specifically asked about the bridge during their walkthroughs and had been assured it was part of the community. One woman named Priscilla Vaughn told me she had a note in her own handwriting from the sales office confirming that the entrance was included in the development. She was not angry at me at all. She was angry that she had bought a $400,000 house on top of a question nobody had answered honestly. At the next regular association meeting, Wade Hollis presented a timeline, and he presented it the way a freight operations manager would, date by date, decision by decision, with source documents projected on the wall behind him. The month the permanent bridge disappeared from the resident newsletters. The month Lenora took the president's chair, the message asking whether the temporary route could be decommissioned early, the landscaping exhibit with the line about the Rowan crossing, the first violation notice sent to a non-member, the message about applying pressure through maintenance liability displayed full screen in the association's own font. When he finished, nobody in that room needed anything explained to them. Lenora still tried. She stood and said that everything she had done was in service of protecting the membership from an unnecessary expense, and that if I had simply been willing to cooperate, none of this would have cost anybody anything. She said the community had extended goodwill and had received hostility in return. I was sitting in the back again, and when she finished, I answered her without standing up. I said cooperation does not mean I hand you my bridge. That was the whole of it. There was nothing else to say, and the room seemed to agree. The board removed her as president that night by a vote of 4-1, with Lenora casting the single dissent, and Wade Hollis was appointed to fill the seat until the next election. The association retained new counsel within the month, and that council's first act was to formally withdraw every notice, violation, and assessment ever issued against my parcel, in writing, which I added to my box. The development company entered negotiations with the county over the bond, and by midsummer had committed to designing and constructing the permanent 2-lane crossing described in the original plat. The temporary northern route stayed open the entire time as the interim access, exactly as the permit had always required. It was not a punishment. It was simply the deal the developer had made 3 years earlier, finally being kept. A separate settlement was reached regarding my crossing, and it was narrower than people assume. The developer and its insurer accepted responsibility for the damage attributable to construction traffic, which Grant Hensley had documented and quantified, and funded the repairs. New steel where the stringers had deformed, underpinning and repair of the east abutment, full deck replacement, and restoration of the guardrails to the original profile. I did not ask for punitive money, and I did not ask for a payment for years of unauthorized use, though a lawyer told me I could have made a real case for both. I asked for 3 things and only 3 things. No new easement of any kind, no association traffic, no association signage on my land, ever. People have asked me whether I regret not taking more, and I do not, for a reason that has nothing to do with modesty. The moment I asked for a large check, this stops being a story about property lines and becomes a story about a man who found a way to get paid, and Lenora would have spent the rest of her life telling it that way to anybody who would listen. I wanted the record to be clean. I won with a deed, a survey, a plat sheet, a permit condition, a stamped engineering report, and 90 days of video, and I never raised my voice at a single person in that subdivision. That is a different kind of victory than a settlement number, and it holds up better over time. My father would have understood the distinction immediately. Construction on the Cedar Hollow Bridge began the following autumn, a comfortable distance downstream from my land, with real abutments poured on their own frontage and rebar cages sitting in the sun like something out of a textbook. I could hear the pile driver on still mornings, and I did not mind it once. My own crossing was finished before theirs was, and the difference in it is something I notice every time I drive across. The deck is new oak, tight and quiet under the tires. The steel is repaired, primed, and painted the same dark green it has been since I bought the place. The guardrails came back in the original profile, and the settlement crack in the east abutment is gone. The Cedar Hollow sign went away too. A maintenance contractor pulled the posts and dug out the concrete on a Tuesday in June, and I raked the ground smooth and threw down grass seed the same afternoon. I put in a modest gate at the head of my approach, a simple swing gate with a small placard that reads Private Drive, and I want to be clear that it is not there out of spite. It is there because a boundary that nobody can see is a boundary somebody will eventually decide does not exist. That is the only real lesson I took from all of this. The paper protects you, but only if you are willing to make the paper visible. I saw Lenora Vance one last time, in September, when she came to collect some association records that had been left in the clubhouse storage room after her removal. She parked on the shoulder of the county road and walked partway down my approach, and she stopped when she got to the gate. She looked at the fresh deck and the painted steel for a while before she said anything. Then she said, in a voice that had all the sweetness scraped off it, that in the end I had gotten myself a nearly new bridge for free. I let that sit for a second because I wanted to answer it precisely rather than quickly. I told her, "No, Lenora, I only got back the bridge you broke." She did not have a reply for that, and she did not need one because we both understood the arithmetic. She had spent an enormous amount of energy trying to move a permanent liability onto a man she assumed could not read a plat, and she had ended up with no chair, no leverage, and a subdivision that finally knew what had been done in its name. I stood at my gate and looked past her, downstream where the crane was setting the first girder for the Cedar Hollow crossing against a hard blue sky. 28 houses were finally going to have the legal entrance they had been promised before the foundations were poured. And I still had every square foot of what I had bought. She once stood on my land and ordered me to repair my bridge so it could serve her 28 houses. In the end, they repaired my bridge, and then they built their own.